every one of you to our uh, Bible series. And these three talks will be centered on how we can better understand the Old Testament. But of course, being only three talks, we have already very limited time. So I will focus only on three topics today. We will talk about the Genesis accounts of God's creation. Now, when we read the Bible, the book of Genesis, we often begin with that because that is the first book of the Bible. And then immediately we come into contact with the description of how God created the universe. These two are the major questions that I often hear people asking. The first is like, because of the creation in 6 days, God rested on the seventh day. So people ask the question, did God really create the universe in 6 days? And then there is this other questions about the creation of the human persons. And did God create Adam out of clay and then pull up a rib from him and created Eve out of Adam's rib? Of course, we are not just going to talk about these two issues. We will examine the creation accounts in the book of Genesis. After that, I will give you some clues, general principles as to how we can better interpret, better understand the book of Genesis in particular, and then the other books of the Old Testament in general. But as I say, our time is very limited. There may be many remaining questions that you can and you should explore further. Now, if you look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, there are actually two accounts of creation. Two, not one account. And the first account is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 4a. Interestingly, 4a, because that verse is quite long and is actually divided into two parts. And we call the first part A and the second part B. Just a reminder that during the sessions that you should not turn on your mic. The host has muted all your mic, but you should not turn it on personally. So this is part of the etiquette attending online sessions. Okay, and the second account of the book of Genesis of creation is actually from chapter 2, verse 4b. That means the second part of that verse till 25. So we actually have two, not one account of God's creations. Now, by the way, just a remark here about the chapters and verses of the Bible. Now, the original Bible had no divisions into chapters and verses. So now when I talk about the two creation account, and the first one actually ends at chapter 2, 4a, it is because some people during the Middle Ages, specifically in 1529, the Dominican Pagini, he was the first who proposed the division of the Bibles into chapters for each book. And then in 1551, a librarian in Paris, Robert Estienne, put on the verses. So today, as we see it, the chapters and verses were only invented, so to say, in the Middle Ages. So originally, if you read the Bible prior to that, then you would not say that, well, first creation account ends verse 4a in chapter 2. So this is just a remark. So the first creation account from the Genesis chapter 1 to 2, chapter 2, 4a, it says that in the beginning God created heaven and earth. Now the earth was formless, void, was darkness over the deep, and the divine wind sweeping over the waters. God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw the light was good, and God divided light from darkness. God called light day, and darkness he called night. Evening came, and morning came the first day. And then subsequently, as you read, God said, blah, blah, blah. God said, blah, blah, blah. God said, blah, blah, blah. Evening came, morning came, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day. Verse 26, God said, "Let us make man in our own image, in the likeness of ourselves. Let them be masters of the fish, the birds of the heaven, the cattle, all the wild animals, and all the creatures that creep along the ground." God created man in the image of himself. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Evening came and morning came, the sixth day. So you have the creation account, day 1, day 2, up to day 6. Each one ended with the expressions, evening came and morning came, the first, the second, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. And the sixth day, of course, is the important one, because on that day, it is said that God created the human persons in his image. And then we move on to chapter 2. Thus heaven and earth were completed with their array on the seventh day. God had completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day after all the work he had been doing. God blessed the seventh day and make it holy, because on that day he rested after all his work of creating. Such was the story of heaven and earth as they were created. You can see from the very expressions that this verse, "such was the story of heaven and earth as they were created," kind of conclude this first account. And therefore, later on when we read the seventh account, you see that the way it is being narrated, it is starting another narration, starting another account. Many of you have read the book of Genesis already, so reading through this is just to leave you that impression, okay, what is being said in the first account. So now we move on. As a summary, you can see day 1, day and night, the water above, the water below. Day 3, on the earth, the dry land and the wet land. Fourth day, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Fifth days, the birds above and the living creatures in the sea. 6 days, you have the creation of the human persons. And then on the seventh day, God rested. So this is a quick summary. Now we look at the second creation account, which starts at chapter 2, verse 4b to verse 25. Now, as you read this 4b, you see that the expression is starting to tell another story. So at the time when God made earth and heaven, just now that remark 4a kind of concluded the first account, and this opening statement begins the narration of the second account. Verse 5, there was yet no wild bush of the earth, nor had any wild plants yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, nor was there any man to till the soil. Lord God shaped man from the oil of the ground, from the soil of the earth, and blew the breath of life into his nostrils, and man became a living being, etc. Lord God said, "It is not right that man should be alone. I shall make him a helper." So from the soil, Lord God fashioned all the wild animals and all the birds of heaven. Then the Lord God made man to fall into a deep sleep. While he was asleep, he took one of his ribs, closed the flesh up again forthwith. Lord God fashioned the rib he had taken from the man into a woman, and brought her to the man. And the man said, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She is to be called woman, because she was taken from man. This is why a man leaves his father and mother, become attached to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now both of them were naked, the man and his wife, but they felt no shame before each other. So that is the second account. And you can see that they are very distinctively two separate descriptions of God's creation. Now we make a comparison between the two accounts. I provide you a table. So the first column and then two other columns, second and third column. The second column, we have the first account. The original state described was watery chaos. For the second account, waterless waste. And then the first account described God's creation in 6 days. The second account, no note of time. There is no division to the first day, second day, third day, and so forth. And then the order of creation. In the first account, first you have the descriptions of 3 days of separations. How God separated the darkness and light. God separated the water above and water below. God separated the dry land and the wet land. And then 3 days of decorations. God put in this particular phase certain items, and then at another space, some other items, and so forth. Whereas for the second account, it was kind of a continuous description. Man was first created. He was put in the garden. There were trees, animals, and birds. Then God felt that man should have a companion because no other animals was found to be suitable to be his companion. Then God created Eve, taking the rib up of the man when he was asleep. So it was a long passage about the creation of human beings. The whole focus was on actually human persons. Of the other things are just kind of a byword. Whereas the first account, very distinctive descriptions of day one, certain creation, day two, day three, day four, day five, day six. Now, with regard to the creation of the human persons, the first account mentioned that male and female, he created them. No distinction about man first and then woman. However, the second account very clearly, God created man first, named Adam, and then later on, God created a woman named Eve. And the style of writing, if you compare the two accounts, the first account is a very systematic way of presentations, step by step, day by day, and what has to be included would be included. So the author tried to include every aspect of creation into the days. Whereas the style of writing for the second account is a very dramatic style, animated style. God used the soil and fashioned Adam, and then pull out a rib and then fashion woman. God brought the women in front of Adam. Look, and Adam acclaimed, oh, wow, you are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. Now, just by this simple table, you can see that really these are two very distinct accounts of God's creations. And the style of writing, the tone, the manner, both accounts are quite separate one from another. So we would want to ask these questions. If there were two accounts, then how the two creation accounts eventually came together as if one single account. Now we must know that the writing of the books of the Bible, all of them took a long time. There were stages of writing. Now, since today we are talking about Genesis, so we will just talk about the book of Genesis itself. This book of Genesis was not written at one go by one single person. No, it took a long time for the eventual writing of the book of Genesis. At first, it started with some oral traditions, stories being spoken about. And then later on, there were pieces of written work here and there, short stories. And then someone came to compile, put together all these written materials, and then the final redaction. So there were stages over a long period of time. Now, this final redactor of the book of Genesis, who we don't know, uh, it was ascribed to Moses, but I will explain later. Moses could not be the single writer. Anyway, the final redactor of the book of Genesis decided that, yeah, these two narrations, the story about the creation, were meaningful and they could be used for him to convey what he felt received from the inspiration of God, to convey certain message about God's plan of creation. So he put them together and presented them as if it's one account of creation. And people in the past, biblical scholarships occurred only very recently, the most 100 years. Prior to that, when people read the Bible, they thought that chapter 1 and 2, in fact, that time there were no division of chapter 1 and 2, that whole account, they would thought that it was just only one story about God's creations. Only recently, with biblical scholarships, that scholars were able to decipher very clear distinctions between the style of writing of these two accounts and be very firm and definite in saying that in the book of Genesis, as we have today, there are actually two creation accounts being put together as one. So where do they came from? The very origin of these two accounts. Scholars says that most likely they came from two sources or traditions. The first account came from the priestly traditions, meaning that those who compose this account from the priestly caste. We know that Aaron, the brother of Moses, was elected a priest, and later on, those from his tribe, the Levites, uh, they are the priestly caste. They are the priestly class, and from this tradition, they preserve the tradition of the first creation account. It had, of course, a very ancient oral traditions, but eventually written around the year 6th century BC. The style very structural, very systematic and organized. And then the second creation account came from what is known as the Yahwist tradition. The Christian, they call it Jehovah, the Yahwist Jehovah traditions. And it was even more ancient, written around 1,000 years before Christ. The style very dramatic, very animated. Now, later on, the final compiler, the final redactor of the book of Genesis put them together. Now, today we are only talking about the first two chapters of book of Genesis. Then there are other chapters in the book of Genesis, and then we will find out that, oh, there are even more ancient traditions contained in the book of Genesis, and eventually they were all put together as one single book. Now, for many of us, lay person, when we read the book of Genesis, one immediate question that come to our mind would be these questions. Did God create the universe in 6 days and rested? did God rest on the seventh day? And the answer is most probably not. How do we come to that conclusion? Because if you look at the sequence of descriptions for the first account, it was said that God created light and darkness in the first day. But how do we know it is light? How do we know it's darkness? Today we say that we use the sun to determine day and night. When the sun rises, there's sunlight, then there is day. When the sun sets, so-called set, um, of course, we are using day-to-day terms to describe. It is night. So you need to have the sun in order to be able to for us to render day and night. But it is said that in the first day there was already day and night, and then only on the fourth day that sun, moon, and the stars were created. So you see a kind of a logical conflict here. Now another question is that the start of a week is rendered actually differently culture to culture. What the Hebrew call the first day of the week is actually Sunday, and then Friday is the sixth day, and Saturday is known as the Sabbath, the seventh day. But for another culture, Monday is rendered the first day of the week. And in ancient Chinese civilizations, they do not have the 7-day week system. The Chinese calendar has 3 division of 10 days in a month. 10 days is called a xun. So they have the upper xun, middle xun, and lower xun. So that means 10 times 3, 30 days. So when the creation account, the first account was written, the 7-day week was already in existence in the ancient Middle Near East, places like Persia, Babylon, and so forth. And in fact, the author fit the materials into the 7-day week system rather than because God created the universe in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Therefore, we have the 7-day week system. But rather, at the time of writing, there was already the 7-day week system, and the material was just being fit into the 7 days. If you have questions, you can ask later. But then, why was it narrated in such a manner? Actually, if you pay attention on the diagrams that I have placed in the slides, as in the one that I have now, at the bottom part of this particular slides, you know that the divisions and descriptions were for easy rememberings. So that evangel redactal of the first account have 3 days of separations. First day God separated light and darkness. Second day, water above, water below. Third day, dry land and wet land, plus vegetations. And then fourth day, 3 days of decorations. In the space of light, you put the sun. The dark place, you put moon and stars. And then you have the vault above, you put the birds. And then below the water, you put fish and all the sea creatures. And then the sixth day, you have especially men. So if you present it in this way, now even if you close the book, you don't read the text, you can easily tell me, if I ask you now, first day, what was being created, you'll be able to tell me. this style of writing in a very systematic manner is for the purpose of easy rememberings. Remember, in ancient times, they rely on oral tradition. At that time, writing was limited, and so you tell stories by words, and you want people to remember. And how you want to get people to remember? You want to present in such a way that it is easy to capture the informations. And we say that this first account was preserved by the priestly class from the priestly tradition. And of course, for the priestly class, the Sabbath day was a very important day. They want to emphasize on the Sabbath obligation that people should rest on the Sabbath day. And therefore, it's presented that God rested on the seventh day, the Sabbath day, which is our Saturday today. Now, then you may want to come to that ultimate question. So is it really that God created the universe in 6 days, or is it not? We don't know really. And we don't have to know, because the answer to this question is not important. Whether it's 6 days or 1 day or 5 days, or we don't know. And God could have created the universe in any number of days, of course, God being omnipotent. And so it really has no great significance in that sense, other than if we want to emphasize on the need for Sabbath day, then we don't really have to kind of insist that God actually created the universe in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. This question and the answer is not important. Then what is important? What were the intended messages conveyed in the first account when the redactor, the final compiler of the book of Genesis, wanted to convey to the readers? God was the creator of all things. And among those created things, the human persons were the crowns of God's creations, because they were created in the image and likeness of God. And God wanted men to be masters of all creations. And God blessed the seventh day and make it holy. So that was the intended message. This, if the readers accept, the author has fulfilled his intention of writing the book of Genesis. Not whether God actually created the universe in 6 days or not. That was not important. I realize that I have a lot of materials here, and the time is running short. I will go as fast as I can, but I may exceed the time 9 p.m. for that presentations. Now the second account, the question we asked then would be, did God create Eve out of the rib of Adam, and did God created Adam from soil? And the answer also probably not. If God would created Adam out of clay alone, why would he need a rib to create Eve? There's no necessity. But there is a symbolic meaning in that, because eventually when Eve was created, Adam acclaimed, "Oh, this is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone." So that acclamation actually brings up the closeness, the intimacy between husband and wife. And that is the message that was intended to present. Now we ask the question, if human beings could have created without the union of sperm and egg, just purely by clay and the rib, why not subsequently? Why subsequent procreation need the union of men and women through the sperm and egg? And then another question, if Adam and Eve were the only two persons created, then future generations of human beings would be born out of sibling incest, because subsequent generations were all children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Adam and Eve. That would means total incest. Now, this is very difficult questions, and we have no answer to that. But one thing we are very sure that we don't have to, and we should not take the account literally, because this second account is not intended to tell us that God actually and really created Adam and Eve, first man and first woman, in this particular manner, using clay and using the rib. So if the creation account is not factual, then how did God create man? Nobody knows. And it does not matter. What matters is the intended messages presented through the creation account. And so for this second creation account, the intended message, God was the creator of all things. And after God created all things, God entrusted all things to the care of man. We are stewards of God. We have that great responsibility of looking after the earth, the world. And then God created man to be a social being, male and female, he created them. And that man and woman, they share the same human dignity. They were to complement each other so that man and woman together will live out the purpose that God has created the human persons to be. And then finally, man and woman were called to intimacy in marriage. Now we will take a separate lecture to talk about the theology of creation. Now today I just want to impress upon you that there are two creation accounts, there are two different styles of writing, and we do not have to, and in fact we should not take the two creation accounts literally, word for word. It's not meant to be understood literally. Then how should we understand the Bible in general and the book of Genesis in particular? First, we must know that the Bible is not a book of science. It's not going to present us any scientific knowledge. So if you want to take the creation account and say that if there is there any scientific theory behind these creation accounts, no, because it's not meant to be a book of science. Neither is it meant to be a book of history or geography. So if you want to find modern understanding of history, modern understanding of geography, by reading the two creation accounts, you can't find data to substantiate any theory for history or geography. Then what is the Bible? What is the book of Genesis all about? It is a book of witness. It is meant to convey the faith of the people, ancient Israelites, through the inspirations of the authors, through the writing, to express their faith in God and the invitation to respond with faith to God the Creator. Now, a few principles about biblical interpretations. I am not highlighting all the principles because we don't have much time now. Just some key points. In the next two lectures, I will continue to talk about some other principles of biblical interpretations. Now, today I just want to impress upon you that the Bible is the revelation of God, which we all agrees and we all accept. But we must not forget that the Bible is also written by man. God has chosen some people to eventually pen down the books. And each book, in the case of Book of Genesis, each book has its human authors. And therefore we must understand the human aspect, the human elements of the writing of the biblical books. Another principle of biblical interpretation, we must know that the revelation of God was not done by dictation. It is not true that someone one day received inspiration from God and God dictate to him, now you take out pen and pencil and you write down as I dictate to you, as I voice out word for word, you write down accordingly. No. Biblical inspiration is not in that manner, not God dictating to the author, but rather God inspired certain authors to write in human way. And what do you mean by human way? Human way means, yeah, like you and I, when we write, we base on our vocabularies, we based on our literary skills, we based on our knowledge and so forth, and we write according to who we are as human persons. Of course, the difference is that for biblical writing, the authors, they had the inspiration of God. But nonetheless, they wrote in human manner. And the Bible was not written by one person in one setting. There were more than one author, in fact, many authors, especially the Old Testament books. Just now we mentioned about the book of Genesis. Already we find two traditions from two different kind of sources, and then they were written over a long period of history, first starting with oral traditions and then scattered pieces of work and then compilation and so forth. The book of Psalms, for example, also we always attribute it to David as the author of the book of Psalms, but we know biblical scholars, this one we need a separate lecture, that no, not David alone who wrote all the 150 Psalms, but ancient people always like to attribute an important work to a famous person, and in this case they attributed to David, and the Pentateuch they attributed to Moses. But we know that there were more than one author, many authors in fact, and it was a long process. The creation accounts I've explained to you earlier took a long while for the eventual compilation into one single book called the Book of Genesis. And because we need to know the human aspects, because the books were written by men, human authors, so we need to know the human author's personal background, if we can identify the author, and their social backgrounds as a group, the time, the people, the culture of the time. If we understand these two aspects, the personal and the communal background of that writing, then we would be able to better understand certain materials being presented in that book. How do we interpret the book of Genesis? Here, I give you a simple rule. You must distinguish between intended message, what the author wants the readers to learn from, and the style of writing, how I want to convey my message. How do I want to present my materials? How do I want to help the readers understand my message? That is the meaning of the style of writing. And the intended message would be the ideas that I want to convey to the readers. And we see in that creation accounts that the first creation account, the style of writing, as I mentioned, the priestly tradition, very systematic, very organized, day by day. And then the second account, the style of writing, very poetic, very dramatic, very animated, another style of writing. And each has very serious message that they wanted to convey. The serious message would be mainly that God is the creator of all things. And among all God's creation, the human persons are the most important creatures, and some other related messages which I explained to you earlier. Now I have gone through the slides very quickly. So here I want to conclude. Later on you may have some questions, and I try to address a few questions before we move on. Now, the conclusion is that the strength of our faith does not require a literal interpretation of the Bible. We don't have to accept that, yeah, God actually literally created as accounted by the authors in the first creation account, the second creation, that was actually what happened. No, we don't have to accept those descriptions as literal, as factual to be people of faith in God. We must know and learn how to understand and interpret the Bible in a way that properly respect the reality. The Bible is at the same time an inspiration, a revelation of God, and at the same time, authentic human writing. That means the human authors use knowledge, skills of his time to present the intended message. And what is important, as I mentioned, that the Bible is a book of witness, not meant to be any other book, but a book of witness. And this witnessing is the witnessing of faith. When you read the Bible, if you are inspired to have a greater sense of uh, belief and submission to God, then the author has achieved his purpose. Now, the author, the authors rather, as do not intend you to literally accept what they have presented using a particular skills style of writing. So this is the end of my presentation.